I'm Gian DeLeon, and this is K11 Konversations, a podcast where we discuss the intersections between creativity and innovation, in line with K11's social mission to incubate talent and propagate culture. On today's episode, I'm speaking with architect and artist Daniel Arsham. You might know him through his crystallized Pokémon sculptures commemorating the 25th anniversary of the franchise, his collaborations with Dior, Rimowa and Uniqlo, or any of his so-called Future Relics, eroded plaster sculptures that resemble everyday objects ravaged by time. Just in time for Lunar New Year, Arsham partners with K11 Museum to take on one of the occasion's most prominent artifacts, the red packet. Representing thousands of years of Asian history, the practice of giving out red packets dates back as early as the Han Dynasty, where coin-filled envelopes were thought to ward off evil spirits and bring good fortune. That makes them the ideal object for Arsham to put his stamp on. Let's check in with Arsham in his Brooklyn, New York studio. How did you get involved with K11 Museum and Adrian Cheng?
So the first project I did with them was a couple of years ago. Obviously been there a number of times pre-pandemic when we were traveling. And there was a Philips event there that was surrounding the eroded 911 Porsche that I did. So through some connections that I have with Archive Editions, the platform that I have there in China, they reached out about designing these red envelopes. And it seemed like an interesting thing. It's something that celebrating the new year, and happy to work on that with them.
So Archive Editions you launched, I believe, in April 2020 with a Pokémon edition, right? It was the Pikachu that was limited to 500. What was the impetus for further expanding your practice into China? We had been at Intersect in Shanghai, where you had released some of the app portfolio, Mickey Mouse collaborations, as well as some of the other editions. When did you notice this growing audience in China?
Yeah, so some of it was through both the project at Intersect as well as the exhibition that I did at How Museum 2019. And part of the thing that I started to realize is there was this huge audience there that was interested in the editions that I was making, but they were very difficult to get in China. My website didn't always work there, and the shipping was always an issue. So I started thinking about ways that I could engage further with that audience. And Archive Editions was born out of that, which was really a platform that was releasing editions that were only available there. On some occasions, they are mirror editions based on things that I've also released here. The Pikachu is an example of that, as well as the Porsche. But the biggest thing for me is just being able to reach that audience and engage with it. I think as the audience there becomes much more interested in art, if we're not able to bring the work to them, it sort of closes down the conversation. So
Asia in general and its relationship with relics, right? You have the Terracotta Warriors, which have been a reference for Edison Chen of Intersect in his collaboration with Nike, and now working on the red envelopes, which is another one of Asia's cultural relics. What's your interpretation of how, when working and reinterpreting these items, the histories associated with them often go back much longer than, some of the Western world and some of the relics that you've been reinterpreting within your practice?
Yeah, certainly Chinese culture, at least in relation to what we have here in the US, it goes back a lot further. And I think that Chinese culture has also intertwined objects and furniture and architecture into the symbolism of their universe in really interesting ways. A couple of years ago, I was really fortunate to be able to visit Forbidden City in Beijing on a day that I think it's like a Monday that they're closed. So I was there when nobody was there. It probably felt the same on that day that it did hundreds of years ago. So, it's been interesting for me to engage directly with it beyond things like this red envelope. I haven't done a lot with that, but looking forward to, once we get out of this, getting back there. I actually have a pretty large exhibition opening there this summer at UCCA Dune, which is about 3 hours outside Beijing.
Oh, wow. Now, one thing that I was reading in Vogue, Adrian Cheng just did an interview, and I think it's a quote that I think there's a lot of parallels within your work, where he talks about the context of K11 Museum and this sort of all-encompassing, converging cultural experience. But he says that artisanal objects have a heritage and a story behind them that everyone should be able to experience. And I feel like that aligns quite nicely with what you're doing with this project, but also even in your recent exhibit, Time Dilation at Paratown in New York.
part of the reason why in my own work I've moved around and worked in many different areas. And part of that is the art world, with a capital A, I think can be often sometimes very closed universe. And it certainly doesn't encompass all the interests that I have in sports and furniture and architecture and fashion and all of these other areas. So I found that allowing my work to engage in those areas only broadens the audience, and it makes things much more open for everyone to feel like they can approach and experience.
And in what ways? Because he also talks about how a decade ago, everyone was talking about art for the masses. Now it's about delivering culture for the masses. So one of the things I really think is interesting is there's this approach to your work, a term I use often, right? It's almost like tricking kids into eating their vegetables, where you have some of the Pokémon work, you have some of the additions like Pharrell's first keyboard, but you also have Michelangelo's Moses, the Venus de Milo. Even quite recently, I think for the NGV Triennial, there was a Hero and Leander painting that you reinterpreted. I think you described it as a conversation across 400 years of art history. So in what ways are you sort of using the familiar and things that people will gravitate towards or perhaps post on social media to have a larger conversation and perhaps introduce them into that art with a capital A world?
I mean, if you think about the evolution of human history, and if we use art as a marker and how to read that, you reference Michelangelo's Moses, which was created during the Renaissance 500 years ago. Works that I've created around Greek mythology or Roman mythology, they're 2,000 plus years ago. And the Pokémon works or anything else that I've created that integrates something from this era. All of that happened, let's say, within the last 2,500 years. 5,000 years from now, Pokémon and Michelangelo Moses are in a very short distance apart, actually, in time. Especially when we think about Roman to Greek work, even in the span of like the Roman Empire, that's a multi-hundred-year span, even though we couple it all together into one era. And I think that if we're able to project ourselves into the future and look back on this era with this larger distance of time, right? Interesting collapses happen about how we interpret history. All of a sudden, Pikachu is happening in the same era as a Michelangelo work.
That's like the titular time dilation you're talking about, right? It's like the meme where we're actually closer in time to when the moon landing happened than the civil rights movement, et cetera, that people speak about when it's kind of like one of those feel old yet kind of questions in some ways. Now, one thing that I think is also interesting about the Red Packet collaboration is it also aligns with this time that you've been working more with painting, with drawing, and in a 2D medium. So how has obviously working in quarantine gave you an impetus to explore that as a medium? In what ways does this particular collaboration already build on the themes that you've been working on and can be seen in your recent exhibit?
So, I've gone back to painting to a large degree over the last year. And it's funny, I've been literally going back through all of my archives and even looking at drawings, notebooks that span the last 20 years going back to high school. And I think that partly the travel that I've done over the last 10 years, it's drawn me away from the type of work that requires constant attention and focus in a different way. Sculpture is something that I can work on, return back to. I have assistants that help me with it, but the paintings are something that need a very specific touch. And I've also found in the past that I couldn't really start a painting and then come back to it a month later. I don't know, something would change. One area of the painting would have this particular mark making on it. And then over here, I'd notice a difference. And so it really is a condition of being forced to stay in one place, focus on one thing that has allowed me to go back to that. Drawing has also become sort of go-to here in the studio for me. I've been drawing a lot more than I was previously. And I think it's connecting back to a little bit more of, a hand touch in the work. That's certainly interesting for me. And I think also for the audience to draw out the origin of some of these ideas, both in painting, and I'm looking through old notebooks because I'm thinking about compiling a book together of basically like notes on works that have been realized now that I actually first made a sketch of 15, 20 years ago, just to see how long it actually took to iterate these ideas. Looking through a notebook yesterday, there's probably 15 or 20 drawings over multiple notebooks of the same thing. Like I had the idea again, or I was refining it. So they're slightly different, but it took that long to actually kind of iterate and think about the work before it could actually be realized.
That brings me to this post you made. I think it was on Instagram a couple of weeks ago, or maybe even last week, right? Where it's like by the time that the audience is seeing something, you've been working on it for at least the better part of a decade. So how long does it take for something to go from concept to fully formed sculpture or whatever medium you choose to express it in?
The minimum I think is like a year to really realize something properly. But sometimes I can't really trace the origin of a specific idea or where the origin of a material came about within the studio. Because of the way that these things layer on top of each other, it becomes impossible to trace the origin of them. But many years in most cases.
As you're digging through these old notebooks and, these ideas that either recently came into fruition or haven't come into fruition yet, are there any that you want to revisit and maybe bring back that you haven't been able to realize yet?
We were snowed in yesterday, so I was the only one here in the studio. So I literally went through probably 20 different notebooks, and there actually was a couple things in there that I had forgotten about, some random sketches. And usually the drawings that I make that are more detailed are for a particular purpose, right? To articulate a sculpture or something like that. The drawings that I make in the notebooks and even like my writing in there, sometimes I really have to like look at it to actually be able to read it because they're trying to serve a purpose of just getting an idea out. It's often that I'll have to look through like multiple pages to understand, okay, I was thinking about this particular idea using this medium, and then sometimes just reading my own handwriting is difficult.
That's an important differentiation between the drawings and the paintings, right? Because the paintings, I think there was the Tropical Cave of Zeus or the Cave of Diana, right? Those are fully realized visions that it just looks like a snapshot in time. Whereas the drawings very much look like, okay, this is the blueprint for what will be a sculpture down to the materials that would be realized in the sculptural version. How do you differentiate between what will become a sculpture, or is that material part something in the back of your head when you're thinking of painting it, and what kind of colors you'll realize, or utilizing a chiaroscuro for some parts of the painting depending on like the material in your head?
The paintings are highly composed. The images are entirely done in advance, usually in Photoshop, or in the past it was in physical collage. I'm not just painting from memory at that point. I've already composed the image. I know exactly what it's going to look like. And I've also selected a palette for it, which I'm able to like literally separate. So if we think about, you've seen some of these works in real, they're all done in a single tonality. If it's in a green tonality, Golden Paints, which is one of the best paint companies in the world, has pre-mixed that gradient for me. So I don't have to really like spend time thinking about this gradient. I'm able to just go to like number one, and I usually start from dark. I'm putting in the shadows first and I'm building up to light, which makes a much more fluid way to work. When I'm drawing, there is no like direct reference. I'm usually looking at an image of a sculpture. And in some cases, the drawings are done before the sculptures are produced. And sometimes I'll also make drawings after the fact as well.
What is your view on the art scene in China and its collectors and how it's evolved pretty fast quite recently, I would say?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is a built-up interest in the world at large. As audience in China is exposed to more things, one of the most interesting things about it for me is that often their references for art and culture are completely blended together. If you want to talk about the overlap of fashion and art and sneakers and video games and all of these different things, there's not as much of a hierarchy as exists in the West. And I like that because in some ways it's more of the way that I think about things. Something that's not an art object may be valuable to me in my own experience or in my own life as an art object. And the monetary value is less important to me than its value culturally or kind of what it means.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because, as someone who's worked across multiple mediums, be it fashion, sneakers, and fine art, in China and in Asia, there's less of gates between the various works, right? It's like the validity of an Arsham Dior B23 or an Arsham edition to a certain audience, it feels like it could be at the same level as owning a piece of the canon, right? It's all one canon.
Yep. Yeah, which is super rare. I think that you and I have participated in an audience that does communicate that way, but it's certainly not a general art world audience. And there I do find that.
Absolutely. I was having a conversation about Chinese culture and the consumer evolution. And the analogy was they're sort of in this sponging phase, right? Where they're taking everything in and just in this constant intake mode. And they're almost at the point where you sort of squeeze the sponge and new things will start to filter out, new creators and new ideas will begin to emerge. As a brand that has this mission of incubating upcoming artists and young artists, speaking of K11, what are your thoughts on how Adrian and this brand has made strides in helping cultivate this new scene in China?
They've taken advantage of the position that they have and the reach that they have to be able to shine the spotlight on China in general and culture in general, but also some younger artists. And really, that's what they should be doing. I think at the same time, they're taking strides to bring culture into China and expose that, bringing works of mine there. They did a big project with Cause kind of middle of last year. I think that's certainly valuable for their audience.
Certainly, you adapted to post-COVID times by really exploring painting and drawing more in your practice. Now that things are returning to some semblance of normalcy, or people have adapted their respective practices to working in this new paradigm, what are some of the things you've learned along the way, and what are you planning for future exhibitions, in addition to your new position at the Cleveland Cavaliers as well?
In some ways, they are very different roles. Here in the studio, what I'm doing at Snarkitecture, and the role at the Cavs. But in another way, they all kind of feel like the same job. My job sort of everywhere is to digest culture that's coming in and references and sort of filter it through this lens that actually is a reduction lens. It takes all of this stuff and it carves away 99.9% of it, and it feeds it back in this much more minimal way. And so that's a goal kind of across the board. I think COVID and the pandemic and everyone being forced to kind of reevaluate their position, I think that there was an excess of almost everything that I could think of, an excess of travel, an excess of options, an excess of art. I would generally normally never say that there was too much art, but just the amount of art fairs, the amount of, exhibitions that we're kind of bombarding every day, maybe it's been trimmed back a little bit in one way, and in another way with social media and everyone diving into that with even much more force than before, they're exposed to more on those platforms.
Going on with saturation versus scarcity, let's talk about the additions again. And is there a strategy that you're putting forth when you're deciding, let's say, like the color palettes that would be available in China versus what's available in the West, to how many editions are numbered? And I say this because I'm reminded of how there's literally trading cards that you've made as sculptures, Pokémon cards, and how that is a market that oversaturated to now one card has sold for upwards of a couple $100,000 now. So talk about additions. What is your strategy there?
So, it's less of a strategy of what I'm going to release and more about I actually want those things to be available to larger audiences. And I think that this is not something for every artist necessarily, but in any exhibition, I might make 15 or 20 individual artworks. And there's a lot more than 15 or 20 people that are looking to engage with that and have it be part of their universe. And I'm a collector as well of many different types of things, art and design. And I think actually by releasing these as editions, it actually increases the conversation around the work and the engagement with it. So it's a way to really broaden the audience in that way. The project in China with Archives was really about creating a platform that would enable these works to be available there and create something special for that audience as well, because there are things that are released through Archive that are exclusive in China.
And of course, 2020 has been a year of adversity, but for you personally, I feel like it's also been a year of the quote unquote like dream projects coming into fruition. There was the Porsche project that you did another iteration of. There was, of course, the Cleveland Cavaliers position. Is there any sort of other dream project that hasn't come into fruition yet that you would love to see happen in 2021?
Now that I've gotten through the year, I will say almost nothing that happened last year was realized in the way that it was originally intended. So if we think about the Porsche project initially, that was the 930A was originally intended to be unveiled at Le Mans Classic, the race in France. And that was a kind of immense dream to be able to have the car there. The project with the Cavs also, certainly like we announced it in a great way, but like we just came off of this season in a bubble. The Cavs weren't even in the bubble. In a normal season, like I would be at every game that's happening here in New York. I'm not able to do that. I think that we figured out ways to work through that. And it's really setting the stage for where we're going to be after this. I don't think that we're entirely through this moment. I think that we're in this sort of like middle period where we're all trying to figure out, like, are we done with it? When 2021 turned, everyone was like, oh, we're done with that year. But like, it's still the same,
Right. For sure. And I feel like when we're out of this moment eventually, or thinking about this moment, it is one of those kind of time dilation moments where people will measure how close or how far we are to a certain period based on this COVID era, for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for taking some time as usual. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
K11 Konversations is brought to you by K11 Museum and produced by Sonia Manalili. Stay tuned for future episodes.